Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're inviting you to think about identity in a way that, well, it might challenge some of your most basic assumptions. We're not just exploring who you are, in the usual sense, but really digging into who you can be, or maybe even who you feel you are.
Right, pushing beyond those sort of neat predefined boxes we often use.
Exactly.
And it feels like a really crucial way to look at things today. Our goal here is to unpack the many different viewpoints, sometimes ones that clash, actually, on how identities get understood.
Especially race and gender, right? Those are the big ones here.
Yeah, definitely. Are they fixed things? Are they things we choose? Or is it, way more complex, more fluid?
And we're using this idea of trans to help us explore that.
Precisely. Not just in the way people usually hear it, but as a broader concept, like a tool almost, to get at the fluidity of all these identity categories.
Okay, interesting. And we got some good stuff to draw on for this deep dive.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We've pulled from a really rich mix. There's academic work on identity theory, some really powerful personal stories from online communities,
Right.
and also insights from cultural and sociological research. So quite a range.
Sounds like you could really shift how you think about identity by the end.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
So let's start with this academic concept of trans. And it's important, like you said, this isn't just about gender identity here.
Right.
In academia, trans is being used more and more as a lens, a way to think about the fluidity, the kind of movement within and across different identity categories, even race.
Movement. Okay.
Yeah, it gives us a framework for seeing identity as something much less rigid than we usually assume.
That's a powerful starting point.
Oh,
So how do the sources break that down further? What kinds of trans are they talking about?
Well, they outline three main categories, and each gives a different angle on how identity gets navigated. First up is what they call the trans of migration.
Migration. Okay.
This one's maybe the most straightforward. It describes moving from one established category, like sex or gender, to another one.
So a clear shift.
A clear shift, yeah, often involving physical changes, legal changes, someone aiming to fully live within a different but still recognized identity category. The key thing here is that intentional journey into a new established box, if you like.
Got it. Moving from box A to box B. What's the second type?
The second is the trans of between. This is different. It's about defining yourself in relation to two established categories, but without fully landing in either one.
So not quite A, not quite B, but somewhere connecting them.
Exactly. Occupying that space between. You're not definitively moving from one to the other, but kind of positioning yourself with reference to both. It acknowledges their pull, but you exist outside of fitting neatly into just one.
That really challenges the binary thinking, doesn't it? Suggests identity can be a mix.
Absolutely. A blend, kind of a hyphenated way of being.
Okay. And the third one, you said was maybe the most expansive.
Yeah, and maybe the trickiest, conceptually. The trans of beyond. This is where someone positions themselves completely outside the defined, established categories.
Like off the map entirely.
Pretty much. It's a radical idea, really. Transcending the existing categories, or maybe even questioning the whole idea of needing categories in the first place.
Wow.
It pushes the boundaries hard, suggesting some identities might just exist without needing those conventional labels at all. It's not just moving between boxes or straddling them, but the possibility of taking the boxes apart altogether.
That is. Yeah, that's a lot to think about. So how does this academic framework connect to things we see happening, out in the world?
Well, this trans lens gets really interesting when you apply it to some of those big public debates about identity. You remember the whole if Jenner then Dolezal comparison that blew up a few years ago?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It was everywhere. Felt like people were using it as a kind of logical proof almost. Like a syllogism, is that the word?
Exactly, a syllogism, though often used kind of in reverse here.
Ah.
Well, the argument often started with the assumption that Rachel Dolezal, who identified as white but presented as black, couldn't authentically be black.
Right, that was the starting point for many people making the comparison.
And if you accepted that premise, then, for many on the cultural right, the conclusion was that Caitlyn Jenner, assigned male at birth, couldn't authentically be a woman. It was a way to challenge the legitimacy of transgender identity by tying it to something they assumed the public would see as, well, impossible or absurd.
And the source would point out this was a very deliberate tactic, yeah, to try and undermine transgender identities more broadly.
Precisely. It became a really potent, politically charged comparison.
So what about the other side, the cultural left? How do they navigate this? Because it seems tricky.
It was definitely challenging. On one hand, there is a generally strong support for what's called gender voluntarism, the idea that you have the right to determine your own gender.
Framing it as a civil rights issue.
Exactly. And the sources really emphasize the resilience of the trans rights movement, decades of fighting legal battles, social stigma, facing down policies that many see as incredibly cruel. That struggle for self-determination is central.
Okay, so gender choice, largely accepted, championed even. But then the idea of racial voluntarism, choosing your race, that was treated very differently.
Hugely differently. Our sources describe the reaction to racial voluntarism on the left as seeing it as heretical or at best suspect, a really strong rejection.
Why it's such a big difference?
It boils down to some very deep and many would say valid concerns. There's a worry that allowing individuals to just choose their race could weaken the Black community. For example, a community built through shared history, shared oppression.
Right, that collective identity aspect.
And also that it could undermine efforts for racial justice, efforts that often rely on race being a recognized category to track and fight inequality. So for these reasons, race ended up being, as the sources put it, a much more closely policed category than gender in those circles.
So you see this real tension playing out, individual choice versus collective identity and political goals.
Absolutely. And it's not just abstract theory. Our sources bring up some really striking personal stories where this tension is front and center, like the case of Martina Big.
Ah, yes, I remember reading about her. A white woman who undertook some pretty extreme body modifications.
Extremely extensive, yeah. The goal, in her own words, was to achieve a more Black look.
And the sources list some of the procedures.
They do. Breast surgeries, liposuction, veneers, lots of injections, apparently costing around 80,000 euros. It was a very deliberate, very physical transformation aimed at altering her racial presentation.
And her philosophy on it was quite something. Didn't she say the body is just a shell?
Yeah, basically, a body is just a shell that you can change and mold into whatever you want it to be. For her, it seemed less about an internal feeling matching the outside and more that her changed appearance should determine how people see her race.
Did the sources mention how others reacted?
They mention an anecdote where she described being stopped by police or security in a park and feeling she was perceived as a Black woman, which she seemed to take as a kind of external validation of her identity based on how she looked. It's a really complex case.
Definitely. And that leads into another story, this one from Reddit, about the dire-racial experience.
Right. Someone shared this really personal story about feeling a deep connection to Japanese culture their whole life. It started young, family involved in martial arts, Japanese friends. It wasn't just a fleeting interest.
And they talked about being bullied.
Yeah, bullied quite badly, which led them to try and change their appearance, using makeup, dyeing their hair pitch black, trying to look more Japanese or Asian.
How did that make them feel?
They actually said they felt much happier looking that way and that their peers accepted them more readily, which speaks volumes about wanting to belong, right?
But there was still a conflict.
A huge internal conflict. Wanting so badly to be like them, to fit that identity, but also knowing on some level it wasn't their background, their reality in the usual sense.
And they asked that question.
Yeah, a really direct, heartfelt question on the forum. Why can't we be the race we choose? They just wanted to be accepted for who they felt they were without being called racist or judged. It's a raw plea, really.
And finding others online helped. There are communities for this.
Apparently so. They mention finding places like Our Transracialism and Our Transracial and feeling less alone, finding others grappling with similar feelings. It really shows that need for connection, even when dealing with identities that are way outside the mainstream and pretty controversial, people trying to figure things out in uncharted territory.
These stories really hammer home how much our understanding of race is shifting, or at least being questioned.
Absolutely. I mean, historically, we know race has been used by authorities for profiling, for enforcing really unjust systems. But the sources also point out that sociologically, racial categories may in part reflect subjective attributions, self-identities, and social institutions.
Meaning it's not purely biological. It's also about how we see ourselves, how society labels us, the systems we live in.
Exactly. It's shaped by all those things.
And we see that shift in things like the one-drop rule fading away. Right?
Yeah, that's a huge example. That old rule saying any Black ancestry made you Black, it's lost a lot of its power. And that's opened things up, especially for kids from mixed backgrounds, like Black-white marriages.
The census changed too, didn't it? Allowing multiple races.
Since 2000, yeah. You can tick more than one box now in the U.S. Census. That's a big formal recognition that race isn't always a single, rigid category.
And then there's the science. The genetics.
Right, the whole idea of universal genetic mixedness, those DNA ancestry tests that are so popular now, they often show almost everyone has a pretty diverse mix of origins, whatever race they identify as.
So scientifically, it looks more like a spectrum.
In principle, the sources say yes. It could lead us to think of race as this space of continuous and gradational variation, like a smooth gradient rather than hard boxes.
But there's a but, isn't there?
There is. The sources immediately follow up by saying that, in practice, we still mostly understand race in categorical terms.
So even if the science suggests fluidity, society kind of defaults back to the boxes.
Largely, yes. Because race operates through how we classify each other, how society categorizes people. Those social practices are really powerful and persistent, even when the science points elsewhere. It shows how strong social constructs can be.
Okay, so we have the science suggesting fluidity, personal stories, challenging categories, but society is still leaning on the old boxes. And culture reflects this tension too.
Definitely. There's what the sources call the performative turn in culture. Think about movies, books, TV shows. They increasingly seem to highlight how race and gender can be sort of artificial, constructed, maybe unstable, how identities are things people do, things they achieve through how they present themselves, their choices, their actions.
Rather than just something you're born with, fixed.
Exactly. Less stably ascribed and more actively performed or created, like watching a character build their identity piece by piece.
And the effect of that.
The sources argue it leads to a kind of category crisis, not just about male-female, but about categories themselves. It makes us aware of the radical unreliability of embodied appearances.
Meaning you can't always trust what you see on the surface.
Pretty much. What someone looks like might not tell the whole story about their identity, and that shakes up our basic assumptions about how we classify people and ourselves.
Looking ahead, the sources touch on technology too, right? Like genetic editing.
Yeah, they bring up CRISPR, those genetic editing tools. They mention the theoretical possibility of using it someday to alter physical traits associated with race.
Wow, okay. That's a whole other level.
It is. Still very much theoretical in that way. But it opens up a completely new possible dimension for thinking about identity modification.
And then even further out, like science fiction stuff, nanobots.
Right. The idea of total morphological freedom using things like hypothetical nanobot chambers where you could potentially reshape your body completely at will.
Okay, that's definitely sci-fi territory for now.
For sure. The sources are clear that major changes, like altering soul shapes, are purely theoretical rather than practical right now. But raising these possibilities forces some big questions, doesn't it?
Like, what does it mean to be human if our physical form becomes totally changeable?
Exactly. And what kind of ethical lines would we need to even think about drawing? It's mind-bending stuff.
So wrapping this all up, what should we, the listener, take away from this deep dive? It feels like a lot to process.
It is. I think the main thing is seeing that real tension between identity as something given what we're born with or into, and identity as something involving choice.
And how society shapes all that.
Massively. How social context, culture, history, all of it shapes how we understand race and gender. What's accepted, what's rejected. And we've heard those deeply personal stories, too, people navigating these shifting categories in really brave, sometimes difficult ways.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? As our ideas about identity keep changing, with culture shifting and technology opening new doors, what does that mean for society? For how we define who belongs?
How do we balance that push for individual freedom, self-determination with the needs of communities' collective identities? That feels like a central question.
And how might all this change our own culture glasses, our culture brill, the way we actually see the world and ourselves in it?
It's a huge question, and honestly, probably one that doesn't have easy answers right now. It's something that's going to keep unfolding, likely for a long time to come, definitely something to mull over.